How shall one blaze the worth of little things? Thus there are sparkling diamonds to rings. But what needs praise from any since thy pen hath proved a dwarf the miracle of men? Who was this dwarf that had earned such high praise? Was he a great warrior? Did he have great influence in the courts of kings? Was he a skilled duellist that could best his foes? Was he an adventurer going across the Mediterranean? Or was he just a massive meme? The answer is all of them. But who else other than the court dwarf to King Charles I could do all this? Hello and welcome to the Jammy History Podcast, the show that aims to spread the truth on the history you didn't know. I am your host Jamie, and today we'll be looking at the life and times of Sir Geoffrey Hudson, the court dwarf to King Charles I. Now I would like to say that Geoffrey Hudson came from nothing, climbed the ranks through a combination of intrigue and wit, but like a certain other famous dwarf we all know and love, he had powerful connections from an early age. Although he wasn't born into wealth, his father did work for the Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers, as a butcher, keeping cows either for consumption or sport. When Geoffrey was born in 1619, no one knew what an icon they had introduced into the world. But it didn't take long for people to clock on that this little guy was going to stay that way. Little. As a child, he didn't exceed 18 inches tall, so by the time he had passed 2 years old, people had noticed what was happening. So, as all the other children began to grow taller, Geoffrey remained at his usual little height. But to the intrigue of others, his body remained wholly proportionate. What does that mean, I hear some of you ask? Well, we're going to have to deviate from our usual historical programming to answer this. Well, hello there, and welcome to the Jammy Science Show, sponsored by a company I can't say because they haven't paid me yet. And on today's episode, we will be discussing the different types of dwarf. Just imagine me, your host Jamie, wearing a lab coat and twirling an outrageously fabulous moustache. Not everyone knows that there are two types of dwarf, proportionate and disproportionate, and the difference between the two is simple. If the ratio between the dwarf's limbs, heads, and body is the same to that of a fully sized human adult, then they are proportionate. But if the ratio is not the same, either by having a larger head or shorter limbs, then they are disproportionate. So, for example, our beloved Peter Dinklage is a disproportionate dwarf, as he has a large skull and short arms and legs. But if he lived in the 17th century, then he would have just been referred to as a dwarf, because people didn't think to create distinctions and just tossed every short person under the same umbrella term. And that concludes this episode of the Jammy Science Show. Please find someone to sponsor me and my incredible fake twirling moustache, please. I'm sure you've all heard someone say that introductions matter. Those first impressions you leave can determine the outcome of an entire career. And no one took that lesson to heart more than Geoffrey Hudson, because he now had to make the most impressive introduction of his life, and he was only 7 years old at this time. There was a dinner. You know the type. The fancy kind. And this dinner was extra special as King Charles I and Queen Henrietta Maria would be attending. If you were a noble, this was your chance to whip out the best gifts you could offer, in the hope that they'll look upon you more favourably. And what did the good old Duke of Buckingham decide was the perfect gift to present to royalty? That's right, the one, the only, Geoffrey Hudson. Now some of you may be wondering why the king would ever be interested in a dwarf, and the answer was not simply for entertainment. Court dwarfs were seen as a device to enhance the image of a king. That's right, wee little Hudson was the PR tool of the day. The idea was that by having a dwarf stand next to a king, It would naturally make the king look larger and more powerful. King Charles might look weak and pitiful if you slapped him next to the ye olde Arnold Schwarzeneggers littering the countryside, and no one would want to follow a monarch that appeared weak. But as we'll soon see, it didn't do much good for Charles I anyway. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I cannot simply gloss over the iconic way Geoffrey Hudson was presented to the king and queen. Picture the scene. You are the King of England, or the Queen. The analogy works for either one. You have already received great jewels and artworks as gifts from your loyal nobles. You have eaten an assortment of rich dishes, and now you have taken a fancy to this large pie that has been brought to you. Ooh, goody, you think. A bit of dessert and then back to schmoozing with the nobles. But on closer inspection, this pie seems a bit off. You could swear that you saw something move, and then suddenly the pie explodes. Crust goes everywhere, it's a mess, and rising out of the pie is a child. Or at least you think it's a child. It's a bit too small for it to be a regular child. And what's more, it's dressed in a mini suit of armour. This is Geoffrey Hudson, the dwarf brought by the Duke of Buckingham as a present. The sight of this little boy marching on the table in his little suit of armour is both hilarious and adorable. So what else do you do but accept the gift and adopt the dwarf into your court? That is what the king and queen experienced. Queen Henrietta Maria in particular took a liking to the dwarf and was most keen to bring him into her services. And just like that, Geoffrey Hudson was whisked away from his life at home and thrusted into the life of being a court dwarf. It's a good time to mention one source I read whilst researching this episode. I found this amazing book by someone called Microphilius, who wrote about the dwarf he saw at the dinner. Now, we don't know who this Microphilius was. The database I found the source on listed his name as Master Slater, which, unsurprisingly, is also not a name anyone is familiar with. The book appears to be a series of letters between Microphilius and the author of the book. The subject of these letters was simple: the brilliance of dwarfs. The way Microphilius writes, it's like he's never seen anything like this before, and he appeared to be losing it in giddy excitement. What I found most interesting about it was how he praised dwarfs to be more godly than the average man, thus making them the most ideal of companions. He stated that, and I quote, "Men of little stature should be both more valiant and wiser than men of great." You remember that extract I read at the opening of this episode? That was from Microphilius. It was all him. Though I have no idea who Microphilius was, I am glad to see that he got such enjoyment out of this little dwarf he saw one night, and I honestly hope he continued to experience similar joys throughout the rest of his life because it's just precious. As for Geoffrey Hudson, he began his new job as a court dwarf, entertaining the royals and nobles, as well as providing that important PR boost Charles was definitely looking for because his good old parliament were getting a bit rowdy. But don't worry, King Charlie, I doubt anything is going to come from that. He stayed with the Queen's household at Denmark House with all her French and Catholic attendants. Hudson was part of a collection of other oddities collected by the royal family. His fellow colleagues included two disproportionate dwarfs, a monkey known as Pug, and a giant Welsh porter known as William Evans. Interestingly, William Evans was also mentioned in Microphilius' letters as the ultimate comparison to the brilliance of dwarfs. But it seemed that Geoffrey and William became close colleagues and formed an iconic double act in the court. After all, what better matchup could you ask for than the tallest man in the room with the smallest man in the room? There's a great stone carving of the two standing next to each other, and it looks cartoonishly funny. Their classic joke would consist of William reaching into his pocket and pulling out Geoffrey, who was hidden inside, then proceeding to put him into a piece of bread and turn him into a mini sandwich. It was little gimmicks like this that really kept the nobles appeased. Being a court dwarf did have its perks. Geoffrey lived a considerably better life than he would have had he not won the favour of nobility and royalty, even if it was so that they could have something to laugh at. Not only did he get to experience the food and riches the noble lifestyle had to offer, he got the chance to learn skills such as horse riding, and little Hudson would join the Queen and her household on rides, often dressed in the snazziest little suits one could get at the time. And if you thought riding a horse was the most exciting thing he'd learn at this time, then you would be wrong, for he learned how to duel with a pistol as well. Clearly, this dwarf was ready for anything, and it would be a bad move to insult this dwarf's honour. I wouldn't fight him, that's for sure. But it wasn't all fun and games. Well, it really was, but sometimes he had to do actual work as well. After all, he had been raised with the manners and wit of an official court member. When he was just 10 years old, little Geoffrey was sent on a mission to France. This was a very important task, for you see, the Queen needed a midwife, and the court had to be wooed into giving a good midwife over. And who better to appease the crowd than Geoffrey Hudson, with his collection of acts and charm? And by all accounts, the mission was a success. The court were impressed by the antics of the dwarf and negotiated with the rest over a suitable midwife to send Maria. A simple task, but it all went according to plan. At least, it was until they got captured by pirates on their way back to England. That's right, there were pirates in the Channel! I finally get to talk about them. These were not just your casual Pirates of the Caribbean, your Johnny Depp impersonators. These were the Dunkirk privateers. Spanish-funded pirates sent to deal with the Dutch Navy during the 80 Years' War. At this point in time, the Netherlands had been fighting for 62 years for its independence from their Spanish Habsburg rulers, and these Dunkirk privateers were just one of the methods employed in an attempt to quell the rebellion. But just because you were paid to fight against Dutch ships does not mean that the privateers could not engage in side hustles by unofficially raiding other ships that entered the Channel. I mean, who knows which of the many ships in the Channel could secretly be helping the Dutch war effort. Fortunately for Geoffrey and the rest of the crew, the privateers had little interest in any of the passengers of the ship, but they did help themselves to all the plunder they could carry before letting the ship resume its journey back home. This wouldn't be the only time Geoffrey experienced the ongoing Dutch revolt, for in 1637 he would travel over to the Netherlands to observe the siege of Breda, where the Spanish garrison of this important settlement was expelled by the Dutch. For the 18-year-old Geoffrey, this would be his first real introduction into the realities of war, a lesson that was about to come handy back home. While Geoffrey was having the time of his life at court, things for good old Charles I were not looking so good. His parliament were unhappy at the way he was running the country and even starting to get ideas. That just wouldn't do. The political tensions between king and parliament exploded into a civil war in 1642, and the king was going to need all the help he could get if he was going to win. Henrietta Maria took this time to go on a mini tour of Western Europe to crowdfund supplies for the royalist cause, and naturally, she brought her favourite little dwarf with her. The Queen was able to acquire sufficient supplies from the Netherlands to support the royalist cause, yet failed to secure an alliance with them that could have turned the tide of the war itself. The Queen and her entourage returned back to England to find the country had descended into a mess. This was no longer going to be a quick affair where Charles had to put down a little rebel army, but now he had to face roughly half of his country that had declared support for Parliament. Geoffrey and the Queen landed at a small village in Yorkshire called Briglington, but then the most unexpected thing happened. 4 parliamentarian ships appeared just off the coast and began bombarding the town. The Queen fled the village with the rest of her courtiers. All but one small exception. That's right, Geoffrey Hudson was joining the fight. Geoffrey drew his little pistol and his sword and rushed to the docks with the rest of the soldiers to protect all the weapons and ammunition they had brought with them from the Netherlands. The parliamentarians never disembarked from their ships and remained too far away to be engaged with the pistol, so unfortunately our brave little Hudson did not take part in any of the fighting. But when the ships finally cleared off, there still remained one undeniable fact. Geoffrey was prepared to fight for the monarchy. His act of bravery was rewarded and he was appointed, wait for it, Captain of Horse. That's right, he's now Captain Geoffrey Hudson. What a promotion. Now comes the question of, did he actually fight in any battles? Some do consider his appointment to be just another joke or gimmick to improve the morale of the royalist army. But I disagree. Although there's no account of Geoffrey leading the charge into the Parliament lines, there's also no fictional accounts of him doing it either. And if he was there as a joke, or just for show, you'd think they would have done something with that role. After his encounter at Briglington, he and the Queen went to Oxford, where Charles had established his new court, since London was now off the table. This would put Geoffrey close to the many cavalry raids conducted by Prince Rupert of the Rhine. It's therefore not outlandish to suggest that Geoffrey did participate in a couple of those raids. But whether he fought or not, it didn't change the outcome of the war. Parliament would succeed, and good old Charles would end off a head shorter than how he had started the war. As for Queen Henrietta Maria, she fled to France with her entourage, and of course Hudson was there with her. Their life had gone from being the monarchs of a powerful nation to exiles hiding out at Nevers. It was really a fall from grace. And what is perhaps the most interesting is that their exile seems to have brought about a change in Geoffrey Hudson. He was no longer the silly court dwarf everyone knew and loved. Perhaps the years of war and the reality of defeat soured his attitude towards humour and his role as the court gimmick. Hudson no longer wished to be the court dwarf. He didn't wish to be the thing people would laugh at and joke around with anymore. And he took this attitude very seriously. In October 1644, Charles Crofts, the brother of the Queen's Master of Horse, William Crofts, made an insulting joke about Geoffrey Hudson. Scandalous, I know. Although we don't know specifically what the insult was, Geoffrey was clearly not pleased and responded by challenging Charles to a duel. The two got their pistols and prepared themselves for the duel. However, if you believe certain versions of this story, then Charles didn't take the duel seriously, and all he did was bring a simple little squirt gun with him instead, as a joke. I would say Charles lived to regret that decision, but turns out he didn't have time to regret anything, as Geoffrey spun around and shot Charles in the head and he died there and then. Like I said, don't underestimate your opponents. Now Hamilton fans will remember the 10 Duel Commandments song, but in France there was only one Duel Commandment, and it's perhaps the simplest. Don't duel anyone. That's right. Dueling in 17th century France was a criminal offence, and William was prepared to use this to get the death sentence on Geoffrey. This very well could have been where his story ends. After all, he had just committed a capital offence and upset a powerful noble. Yes, he was still an exile, but he still had some influence as a noble. But Hudson was spared by none other than Queen Henrietta Maria, who intervened on behalf of him, and proposed that he be exiled from her court and sent back to England, a proposal that was accepted. And so, Geoffrey began his journey back home to England, the land that he had already fled once. His movements following his exile from the royal court are not known, so we cannot say when or even if he managed to return back home. Now some of you will be questioning the if part of that statement. Surely his story doesn't end on a cliffhanger, right? Be a short episode if it did. Well, to those I say you are correct. It is just that not long after his exile, he was captured by pirates once again. Geoffrey must have been fuming over his poor luck to be captured twice by pirates. Yet these pirates were not the same Dunkirk privateers he had run in with his youth, and unfortunately for him, they were definitely interested in keeping prisoners. These were Barbary pirates. They had sailed all the way up from the coast of Algiers or Tunis to the English Channel to raid ships, steal plunder, and take slaves back with them. Unfortunately for Geoffrey Hudson, he was to be taken as a slave back to North Africa. Being a slave in North Africa was as labour-intensive and brutal as all forms of slavery have been. Once again, there is practically no material on Hudson's experience of slavery. All we can suspect is that it was a terrible experience for him, and that much suffering was had on his part. His time as a slave wasn't short either, for he would spend 25 years doing hard labour in a land that he didn't know. But his freedom did come. Although the details are, again, sketchy at best, it could have been that an offer was made to pay the ransom for his release, as there had been several expeditions from England to ransom back prisoners at the time. Chances are that one of those expeditions paid for the release of Geoffrey Hudson as well. With his newfound freedom, the 50-year-old Geoffrey Hudson could finally complete his previous task of returning home. The last time he had left, the monarchy had ended in England, Parliament was now in control, and he may have expected the country to be a Puritan dystopian society. But he was probably pleasantly surprised at what he returned to. The monarchy was back and stronger than ever. But for Geoffrey, he was done with all royal matters. All he wanted to do was return home to Oakham. And it's not like he couldn't have returned home if he didn't want to. He was invited back to the Queen's court on his return, but he declined. And within a few months of his return, Queen Henrietta Maria died. But Geoffrey did still have business with the royal courts that needed to be cleared up. It was his pension. Gotta reap the rewards after all those years of service, after all. So he went on a little trip to London in 1676. Now, unfortunately for Geoffrey, this was not a good time to be in London, as there was a surge of anti-Catholic paranoia fueled over suspected plots to assassinate Charles II, even though those plots never actually existed. It was a bad time to be a Catholic in London. And unfortunately for Geoffrey, he stands out quite a bit. The return of the Queen's Dwarf did not go unnoticed, and he was arrested for the crime of being a Catholic. Geoffrey was sentenced to spend a considerable amount of time at the Westminster Gatehouse prison, which turned into 14 years of prison time. Poor Geoffrey, he really had a rough run by this time. He was released in 1680, making him 61 years old. Imagine being a 61-year-old man and going through so much in your lifetime. It'd be exhausting, wouldn't it? He returned back home, hopefully with his pension in hand, because he had definitely earned it by that point. Following that slight inconvenience, Geoffrey could get back to his life at Oakham, where he lived for the rest of his life, which turned out to only be 2 years, for he died in 1682. And with that, the world said goodbye to a dwarf that had one hell of a story. So what is the takeaway from this tale? Why does Geoffrey Hudson matter? I think when we talk about people in the past, we tend to focus too much on those that were arguably physically exceptional, and just presume that those outside societal norms were either neglected or merely something to laugh at. But although Geoffrey Hudson started his life very much as a thing to be laughed at by the elites, we see that through his life he outgrew that label, and he became his very own person. Geoffrey Hudson was not just a dwarf, he was a captain, a soldier, a duellist, an explorer, and a man that had survived the horrors of slavery. What is there to laugh at? The recent trend of historiography to look at the lives of those previously neglected has been uncovering stories of marginalised men like Geoffrey Hudson, who all had exciting lives like he did. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Jammy History Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, then be sure to rate the podcast and share it. Also do check out my Instagram and Twitter accounts for more snazzy history tales. I also have a Patreon, so please donate to me on that, like the lovely Lara, Historic Hills, and my own dad have. In the next episode, we will be travelling to the Indian subcontinent to talk about the tiger that defied an empire. Stay tuned for that.